Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 203. Piedmont and the Savoy in the early 1500s. How to lose a duchy.
Lasci colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
As we continue to make the rounds to catch everyone up to the first third of the 1500s, we're heading north from the Kingdom of Naples up through the Papal States and Tuscany, both of whom we have spoken about, then through the Apennines into the Republic of Genoa, and finally we arrive in the current-day region of Piedmont. Now, if the region has one big merit, or shame, depending on your point of view, it's being the birthplace of one Mike Corradi, host of the A History of Italy podcast. Now, I have no real blood ties to the area, as my parents, one a native of the Emilia-Romagna region and the other from Slough, near London, just happened to be there. What's more, the province of my birth, Novara, would have actually been part of the Duchy of Milan at the time we are speaking about. You'll remember that Italy is divided into 20 regions, which have some limited autonomy regarding, for example, transport, health, and education. The regions are further divided into a varying number of provinces, which have no real political function. In any case, I am grateful to Piedmont for being my birthplace, and for Turin, which is one of my favourite cities to visit, and whose magical esoteric mysteries I've spoken about in a Patreon News Cappuccino episode in this period. So, now is a great time to become a member. What's more, we owe a great thanks to Piedmont for such fine wines as Barolo and Barbera. Now, some of the main players in Piedmont in the 1500s were the Marquis of Saluzzo, the Marquis of Monferrato, and of course, our old friends, the Dukes of Savoy. It's hardly worth spending too much time talking about Saluzzo at this point, as they were about to disappear in 1548 when they were gobbled up by the Kingdom of France, and when the locals eventually managed to kick the French out in 1601, Saluzzo would become a part of the Duchy of Savoy. We can briefly mention that a Marquis of Saluzzo, Michele Antonio, was killed in southern Italy fighting for the French against the Spanish in 1528. His death would put an end to the strong French influence in the Marquisate, and it would lead to its annexation. Piedmont in the Italian Wars was of great strategic importance, and consequently suffered from roving bands of alternating soldiers. For France, the area was on their doorstep and the passage through the Western Alps into Italy, so they sought to control or ally with the entities in the area. Since Piedmont was vital for France to have control over, it was vital for Spain for the French not to have control over. Not only to make logistics more difficult, but with the election of Charles V as emperor, he also needed an alternative route to the Trentino area to maintain communications with his European part of his vast empire, as well as towards Spain herself. Therefore, with the Savoy traditionally in the pocket of the French, Charles sought to increase his influence in the Monferrato area, and in particular, it is in this period that the city of Casale increased in size and influence. The local powers could do very little to contrast with what were now becoming international superpowers. Modern nation-states were arising, the state being managed by a growing legal and administrative class whose members were being churned out by the universities, which consequently grew in influence and prestige, with many breaking away from the influence of the church, with the separation of church and state consolidating at the same time. These mechanisms were not really understood by the Piedmontese entities, or they couldn't do much about them. But neither were they by the Republic of Genoa, the Republic of Venice, and the Papal States, so that the peninsula increased the gap with the stronger European powers, leaving most of Italy at their mercy. In the Duchy of Savoy, there had been some attempts at reform to create a modern, more effective state apparatus. As far back as our old friend Amadeo VIII, he who had become anti-pope, there had been attempts in this direction. But they were not followed up by a series of weak dukes after Amadeo abdicated in 1440. You may remember that he had abdicated in favor of his son Ludovico to go into a monastery where, instead of being all holy and religious, he continued to party like a duke, and he was called out of retirement to become anti-pope Felix V. As if all of that wasn't enough, it was he who had gone from being a count to a duke. Another moment of potential political rebirth of the duchy came under Duke Philip II, known as the Fair, particularly thanks to the help of his stepbrother, René the Great Bastard, a slightly less endearing nickname. René served his brother and later his nephew, Filiberto II, with political savvy, maintaining the traditional alliance with France, but also moving towards the empire by managing a marriage between Philip II and Margaret of Habsburg, tying the Savoy to the imperial family. René even tried to reform the administration, but didn't get very far before he was ousted by the same Margaret of Habsburg acting as regent for her son Filiberto II. The whole Savoy business of taking one step forward and two steps back changed quite dramatically with the long and mostly ineffective reign of Charles II, starting in 1504. He went down in history as Charles the Good, but not good in the sense of being really morally so, or being particularly skilled in something. It was a sort of situation like when a friend is trying to set you up with someone and you ask them what the person is like and they say, they're nice. Similarly, in this case, Charles the Good sort of meant that Charles was useless. He was not particularly clever and highly indecisive. He tried to walk the challenging tightrope that some of his predecessors had between France and Spain, but often managed to annoy both. For example, he didn't show up for the coronation of Francis I of France or that of Charles of Spain, and we know that if you want to be successful, you need to do the whole PR networking business. Indeed, important events like coronations and weddings were also an opportunity for a bit of backroom diplomacy. In 1508, facing the threat of marauding Swiss troops rampaging around his territory, he decided to pay them off rather than face them. Having observed the lack of determination, the city of Freiburg in modern-day Germany, that until then had been under the influence of the Duchy of Savoy, decided to break free. The territory of the duchy was poor in natural resources, and indeed we have seen that, historically, the Savoy had built their power base thanks to the control of the Apennine passes. Now they had to rely on taxes and donatives, but due to Charles's lack of authority, the meeting of the General Estates of the Duchy in 1517 and again in 1520 blew him a big fat raspberry, which meant that he had no money for troops, increasing his reliance on foreign powers. In this sense, Charles continued with the apparent neutrality while leaning towards Charles V and the empire. This policy was influenced in no small measure by the person who really seemed to wear the trousers in the family, the Duchess Beatrix of Portugal, who had the strength of character her husband could have done with. She was also the sister of the Empress, which didn't hurt at all. Initially, this alignment with the Spanish seemed to be beneficial, and after the French defeat of Pavia in 1525, the Savoy were rewarded with cities in France. This did not come without immediate downsides as well, one being imperial troops rather than French or Swiss crawling all over the place. The locals were none too pleased about this, and in May of 1526, a rebellion in Turin killed 200 Spanish soldiers, and more would have died if the Duke had not intervened. A little anti-Spanish period with the whole anti-Charles V League of Cognac business saw the Savoy flip back to France before going imperial again. This time, Charles II of Savoy actually showed up at a coronation, that of Charles V, with the Iron Crown of the Lombards in the year 1531. In that same year, Duchess Beatrix, and not the Duke, was rewarded by the Emperor with control over the city of Asti in Piedmont. You, of course, remember perfectly well that the Iron Crown was the one the Lombard kings and later Holy Roman emperors were crowned with. It is supposed to contain a nail from the cross of Jesus Christ and can be seen today in the cathedral in Monza, near Milan. The downside of a pro-imperial policy was soon made very clear to the Savoy when in 1536 French King Francis I decided to have another go at Milan. This time, as he made his way through the Alps and into Piedmont, he saw the Savoy as a hostile force rather than an ally, but they were unable to put up any resistance and fled to Vercelli, while Turin was taken by the French. This round of Italian wars ended in 1544 with the Peace of Crepy, and as far as things between France and Spain went, very little had changed on the ground. The one big difference was that the House of Savoy had gone from a powerful duchy that stretched from France all the way through large parts of Piedmont and into the Ligurian Sea, was now reduced to a strip of narrow, discontinuous holdings. All the territory north of the Alps had been lost, as had many lands in the Piedmont, including the capital Turin herself. Everything that had slowly been built up after more than 4 centuries, with a conquest here, a purchase there, and a whole series of careful marriage alliances from Umberto Biancamano around the year 1000 to Amadeo VIII, was lost in just under 1 century from Ludovico to Charles II. The Duchy of Savoy no longer existed. What was left was inherited by Charles' son, the 25-year-old Emanuele Filiberto. If he wanted to invert the downward spiral, he needed to step up in a very serious manner. It was time to take the duchy back. Would he manage? We know that the Savoy will eventually become kings of Italy, but would they maybe get back on the scene a bit further down the road? Would Emanuele Filiberto just be another in the long line of ineffective, weak dukes? Well, if you have the pleasure of visiting Turin, you can head over to Piazza San Carlo, a gathering place for the inhabitants known as the Parlour of the city, il Salone di Torino, since it is also surrounded by cafes. The first thing you need to do is head over to the Caffè Torino. Under the porticos in front of the bar, there is a mosaic of the symbol of Torino, a bull, toro in Italian. For good luck, you should step on the poor animal's attributes. Then you can admire the twin churches of Santa Cristina and San Carlo, and afterwards head over to a little hidden courtyard on the other side of the square where there is an installation with a large upside-down head of Michelangelo's David. In the middle of the square is an equestrian statue, which is one of my favourites for its dynamism. It shows a man reining in his galloping horse and putting his sword back in its sheath after winning a great victory. The victory is that against the French at the Battle of San Quentin. The man is Emanuele Filiberto, Duke of Savoy, and you can bet that you don't get a statue in an important square for nothing. Thank you very much for listening. A History of Italy is a Sentire Media podcast. It is hosted by me, Mike Corradi, and brought to you by my wonderful Patreon supporters. Coming up on Patreon, we have an episode on Turin and one about the new citizenship laws. I'd like to thank those lovely people, starting from the first third of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level: Alison H., Annie, Aurora T., Benjamin W., Karsten, Catherine C., Silane, Cindy M., Chris H., Cospia Fanboy, David M., Dean V., Demetrio M., Dennis K., Dennis S., Dominique T., Edward J., Edward S., Emily B., and Eric W. And of course, we can never forget the tippy-top Maria Montessori and Dante Alighieri level: Lisa K., Peter W., David L., David C., Sen, David A., Karen D., Bridget T., Dallas R., Joseph V., Stephen G., and Julian. Thank you, one and all. If you'd just like to get in touch, please do so. hello@historyofitaly.com. Or you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, grazie mille for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.